Of every study I've come across, this is the first time I've seen a thinker argue that the biggest threat to human life isn't madness or greed, but plain, cold logic. We usually think of reason as the thing that keeps the monsters under the bed, but Fyodor Dostoevsky, a man who stood in front of a firing squad and lived to write about it, tells us that reason is actually the thing that lets the monsters out. He watched the intellectuals of his day trying to save the world with math and logic, and he realized they were actually building a slaughterhouse. If you can use logic to prove that one life is worth less than 1,000, what's to stop you from sharpening the knife? Dostoevsky is an old friend with very uncomfortable opinions, and he's the one you have to talk to if you want to understand why the world is currently shaking. We're looking at the Russian soul today, not as a collection of dates and maps, but as a living, breathing contradiction that is currently colliding with the West. To understand why Vladimir Putin does what he does, or why Russia feels so alien to the American mind, we have to go back to the idea that some things simply cannot be solved with a calculator. Are we actually rational creatures, or are we something much darker and more beautiful? Let's start with the American side of the mirror, because that's the air we breathe. In the Anglo-American world, we are children of utilitarianism. That's a fancy term for a very simple idea. What is good is what is practical, and what works is what is true. We look at the world and see a series of problems to be solved with science and industry. For us, the meaning of life is the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, which, let's be honest, we've mostly translated into the pursuit of wealth. Our version of Christianity even reflects this. We tend to believe in a God who elects, meaning a minority of people are chosen for heaven because they've proven themselves worthy through their works and their success. Does it surprise you that a culture built on what works ended up becoming the most materialistic civilization in history? The Russians look at us and they don't see freedom. They see a world where the only thing that matters is buying things, consuming things, and obtaining things. They see an expansionist power that believes its way of life is universal. From the Russian perspective, Americans think everyone in the world secretly wants to be an American consumer. We think that if we just liberate people in places like North Korea or Iran, they'll immediately rush out to buy a Big Mac and a new iPhone. We view anyone who prevents people from buying things as a tyrant who needs to be removed so the market can thrive. But what if people don't want to be consumers? This is the clash of civilizations that's playing out in Ukraine right now. It's not just about borders or NATO. It's about two completely different ideas of what it means to be a human being. The Russians believe they are a spiritual people, unique and sovereign, with a right to live a life that isn't defined by Western materialism. They demand the right to be who they are, even if that identity is messy, even if it's violent, and even if it leads to death. In their minds, their conception of God and truth is the real one, and the American version is just a shallow, hollowed-out shell. If it means fighting, if it means sacrifice, they will do it because they believe their soul is at stake. How do you negotiate with a neighbor who thinks your entire way of life is a spiritual sickness? To understand where this intensity comes from, we have to look at the three massive contradictions that make up Russia. It's a place that is both European and Central Asian. It's Viking and it's Mongol. It's Slavic and it's Tatar. For centuries, Russia has tried to erase the Mongol part of its history because it's a bit ashamed of it, but that influence is there in the blood and the soil. Then you have the religious contradiction. It fancies itself the true Christian nation, the defender of the Orthodox faith, Orthodoxy being the ancient, traditional branch of Christianity, but it is also deeply, stubbornly pagan. Even today, the Russian peasantry maintains rituals and beliefs that feel like they belong to a much older, darker world of spirits and nature. The third contradiction is the one that really hurts, the gap between Enlightenment and Empire. Think about Catherine the Great. She wasn't even Russian, she was a Prussian, a German who married into the Russian royal family. She was pen pals with Voltaire, the great French philosopher of reason. She saw herself as an enlightened despot, a ruler who would use reason and justice to bring Russia into the modern world. But she was also running a brutal empire that relied on barbarism to keep its borders. You have this thin veneer of French perfume and rational philosophy sitting on top of a massive, violent, sprawling reality. Can you really bring reason to a land that's so big the army can't even feed itself. This brings us to the Russian way of war, which is a perfect window into their fatalism. Look back at the year 1700. Sweden was the great military power of the age, led by Charles XII. He was only 27, a young man who fancied himself the next Alexander the Great, the ancient Greek conqueror who thought he was invincible. Charles decided to invade Russia, which was a disastrous mistake. Why? Because the Russians used a scorched earth policy. They knew they couldn't beat the Swedes in a fair fight on the battlefield, so they simply retreated and burned everything. They burned their own fields, their own crops, their own homes. If the enemy army can't eat, the enemy army can't fight. This is a pattern that repeats like a heartbeat in Russian history. They did it to Napoleon in 1812, and they did it to the Germans in World War II. It's a brutal, desperate way to win, but it works. It reveals a natural pessimism, a belief that the world is a hard, resource-scarce place where you have to be willing to destroy everything to survive. Americans are optimistic because we have a huge land with lots of resources. If you work hard, you get stuff. Russians are fatalistic because they've spent centuries fighting over very little in a very cold place. Why wouldn't you be a bit dark in your outlook if your history is just one long cycle of invasion and burning your own wheat? This fatalism is often mistaken for weakness, but it's actually their greatest strength. I've often wondered how a people who believe the world is doomed can be so resilient. It doesn't seem to make sense logically, does it? But it's a Viking mentality. If you know the world is going to end and nothing you do really matters in the grand scheme, it compels you to live your best, most intense life right now. Meaning isn't found in a long-term retirement plan. It's found in the life you lead today, in the face of certain doom. This is the heart of Russian Romanticism, the movement that rose up to say no to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, led by thinkers like Kant and Rousseau, argued that reason is our ultimate salvation. If a thing is logical, it's truthful. If we can just think clearly enough, we can save ourselves and civilization. But Dostoevsky and Tolstoy looked at that and said it was complete nonsense. They believed Westernization was only corrupting the Russian soul. They wanted a return to their true selves, to an orthodox civilization where the heart, not the brain, was the center of the universe. For a Russian, the greatest mystery isn't how the stars move or how to build a better steam engine. The greatest mystery is the human heart. This brings us back to Dostoevsky's most famous warning in Crime and Punishment. He gives us a character named Raskolnikov, a young, brilliant, poor student. Raskolnikov is a child of the Enlightenment. He uses logic to decide that he's a genius, and because he's a genius who will one day do great things for humanity, he has the right to commit a crime. He decides to murder an old woman, a pawnbroker. She's mean, no one likes her, and she has a lot of money. Logically, her death is a net positive for the world if Raskolnikov uses her money to fund his greatness. He reasons it out for a long time. It's a perfectly logical murder. But as soon as he does it, his soul collapses. Dostoevsky is showing us that logic can justify anything, including the killing of millions of people. If you rely only on your brain, you can talk yourself into any atrocity. It's only the heart, the seat of spiritual truth, that can tell you that murder is wrong, regardless of the math. This is why modernism, in the Russian view, ruined everything. It stripped away the spiritual and replaced it with the material and the logical. It turned us into Raskolnikovs on a global scale, where we justify any action as long as the utilitarian math adds up. Think about Alexander Pushkin, the man they call the Shakespeare of Russia. He modernized the language and became the national poet, a deeply romantic figure. He represents that first spark of a uniquely Russian voice that isn't just imitating the French or the Germans, but even Pushkin couldn't escape the contradictions. He was a poet of the people who was also deeply tied to the Tsar's court. This is the tension of the Russian artist. You are trying to find the truth of the soul while living in a system that is often brutal and repressive. Dostoevsky himself was a political subversive who was nearly executed. He was standing in front of the firing squad, seconds from death, when his sentence was changed to hard labor in Siberia. That trauma changed him. It made him realize that life isn't a puzzle to be solved, but a gift to be experienced. When he was in Siberia, living among the lowest of the low, he didn't find reason. He found a deep, abiding faith in the Russian people and their orthodox truth. He realized that the university students in St. Petersburg, with their Western books and their logical theories, were the ones who were truly lost. They were chasing a ghost, a modernism that promised progress but delivered only emptiness. Have you ever noticed how the more logical and efficient our world becomes, the more people seem to struggle with finding a reason to get out of bed in the morning? This is why the war in Ukraine is so cataclysmic. It's a clash between the American pursuit of happiness and the Russian pursuit of soul. Putin isn't just talking about land. He's talking about historical, sociological, and philosophical issues that most Westerners don't even have the vocabulary to understand. He sees himself as the heir to an empire that must protect its unique spiritual sovereignty against a globalized, materialistic West. He's playing a game of predictive history, looking at the patterns of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, and trying to prevent what he sees as the final westernization of the Russian heart. The tragedy, of course, is that this defense of the soul is being carried out with tanks and missiles. It's the ultimate Russian contradiction, seeking a spiritual truth through the same kind of empire building and violence they claim to despise in the West. It's Catherine the Great all over again, trying to be the enlightened defender of a civilization while acting as a brutal despot. And this is the trap Dostoevsky warned us about. When you believe you have the real truth, you can justify almost anything to protect it. Is there any difference, really, between Raskolnikov's axe and a cruise missile, if both are justified by a higher logic? We live in a world where we've been told that science and trade would end all wars. We thought that if everyone just had enough things, we'd all get along. But the great books tell us otherwise. They tell us that humans are not utilitarian animals. We are romantic, idealistic, fatalistic, and deeply contradictory creatures. We don't just want comfort, we want meaning. And for the Russian civilization, that meaning is found in the struggle to remain un-Western, to keep the heart as the center of the world, even if it means the world has to burn. It's a terrifying way to live, but it's a pattern that's been written into their DNA since the days of the Mongols and the Vikings. So when we look at the headlines, we shouldn't just see a map. We should see Raskolnikov sitting in his room, trying to convince himself that he has the right to change the world. We should see the smoke from the fields in 1700 and the German princess trying to write letters to Voltaire while her soldiers march across the steppe. Russia is a civilization that refuses to be solved by the West. It's a reminder that the human soul is a mystery that reason can't touch, and that the modern world we've built might be missing the very thing that makes life worth living. I don't think I'd ever want to live in Russia. The racism, the brutality, and the fatalism are a heavy price to pay for soul. But I also can't help but feel that Dostoevsky was right about us. We've become so good at the math of life that we've forgotten the poetry of it. We've traded our sovereignty for a shopping mall, and we're surprised when other people aren't willing to make the same deal. The Russian soul is a dark, cold place, but it's also a place where the heart is still considered the most important thing in the universe. In the end, we're left with the same question Raskolnikov had to face in his prison cell in Siberia. Is it better to be a successful person who has used logic to conquer the world, or a broken person who has found their soul? We've built a civilization on the first answer, and we're currently watching it collide with a civilization that insists on the second. It's a battle where there can be no compromise, because you can't split the difference between a calculator and a heart. If we keep trying to solve the world's problems with more reason and more stuff, are we just sharpening the axe for the next Raskolnikov? Or is there a way to reclaim our own souls without having to burn our own fields?